Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of my American Presidents series, where I am trying to read a biography of every single American president and am slowly succeeding after multiple years of attempting this challenge. This episode will cover presidents between Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, excepting Warren G. Harding because I was not able to find an audiobook at time of listening. The way that I have gone about finding my books for this challenge have been by looking through my library system and finding audiobooks, whether or not I listen to them on my phone or I listen to them in my car on my commute, because when I started this challenge, and for the bulk of it, I was getting 2 master's degrees and I really didn't want to read another really thick nonfiction book. So now that that's over, I hope to go back and start filling in some of these holes, but for the moment, we will move forward as goes. So for my book on Theodore Roosevelt, I read Lion in the White House, A Life of Theodore Roosevelt by Ada D. Donald. This book was, in a way, kind of supplementary because the book that I found on William Howard Taft, who comes after Roosevelt, covered both Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. I couldn't find a book just on Taft. So I knew that I wanted something that focused just on Roosevelt because TR is one of our wildest presidents. Lion in the White House was only so-so. It really didn't stick in my brain for more than the basic biographical details, to be honest. So I really feel like TR deserves more of my attention. But if you don't know too much about Theodore Roosevelt, he is the vice president to William McKinley, who I talked about in my last episode. And William McKinley is shot and assassinated. And Theodore Roosevelt then becomes the youngest president thus far in the history of our nation. And Theodore Roosevelt had been stuffed into the role of vice president to literally get him out of other people's way. He was a firecracker, whether it was in New York City, New York State Legislature, when he came up and was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He just did his own things by his own rules. He also suffered quite a bit of tragedy. His first wife died, giving birth to their only child the same night as Roosevelt's mother died. He said it was the day that the light went out of his life. He ran off, became a cattle rancher in the West, till he came back and again took politics by storm. At the time that Theodore Roosevelt got into politics, it's important to note that politics just wasn't done by people of Theodore Roosevelt's more affluent class. Politics at that point was for the common man. Well, how that's changed. Whew. Anyway, like I said, whether he was president, vice president, assistant secretary of the Navy, New York State Legislature, he just did things by his own rules. So Theodore Roosevelt serves out William McKinley's term, which has really just started, takes his own term, which he is elected for with a great margin. People love him as president. And then he decides on the day that he wins that term all for himself, he goes, I will not seek another term, which technically he could do. At this time, 2-term limits were not codified. And also, really, it was only 1 term since he had served out William McKinley's term previously. He shoots himself in the foot, becomes a lame duck president. All the while, he's like trust busting and negotiating treaties and hurting himself and raising a bushel of kids with his second wife in the White House, running as fast as he can, full tilt towards the next adventure. He chooses his own successor, who is William Howard Taft. So Taft gets elected. He's Roosevelt's named successor, and everybody loves Roosevelt. Roosevelt's like, awesome, I'm gonna go tour around the world, take my family to Europe, go game hunting, do whatever it is big men do. Again, he was the youngest president at that time to become president, so he's pretty young when he leaves office, really regretting the fact that he said that he wouldn't run again. He decides, after Taft's first term, that Taft really wasn't doing a job that he wanted him to do, so he runs again, and this is where you get the Bull Moose Party, because he tries to get the Republican nomination. They go, sir, you are not the sitting president, this guy is. and the Republicans nominate Taft. The Democrats aren't going to choose him, so he creates his own third party. He splits the Republican vote between himself and Taft. Both of them lose, and Woodrow Wilson is elected president. We are going to keep talking about Roosevelt, though, because the book that I read for William Howard Taft technically covers him too, and it is The Bully Pulpit: Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism by Doris Kearns Goodwin. This is a really thick book that intertwines Roosevelt's life with William Howard Taft's life, and also the Golden Age of Journalism, as Doris Kearns Goodwin calls it. And while most of Doris Kearns Goodwin's books that I've read are quite thick, they are so worth it. I learned so much about the Golden Age of Journalism, investigative journalism, the term muckrakers, which I know that I've heard before but never really understood, and how the concept of the press for the first time is really harnessed in such a way by Theodore Roosevelt. And part of the issue with Taft's presidency is that he can never use it in quite the same way as Theodore Roosevelt does. So this is where you really start to see the presidency becoming a cult of personality, which it wasn't really like that before. But, you know, Theodore Roosevelt is also just one of the most forceful personalities who's ever held the office of president. William Howard Taft really was not a bad president. Oftentimes people forget about him, or they think about the fact that his real claim to fame is that later on, after he's left the presidency, he's actually named Chief Justice of the United States, which was all Taft wanted to begin with. Taft's entire life has mostly been about him wanting to be a judge, wanting to be a good judge, wanting to be a charge in a lot, and eventually get to the Chief Justice position of the United States. He almost gets there a couple of times, but his good friend Theodore Roosevelt is like, hey dude, I need you to go like be Governor General of the Philippines, or I need you to be in my cabinet. And he's like, of course, because you're my friend. And I think other than really championing people who are incredible names of the journalism movement, really defining an age of what investigative journalism is, which the book goes through and names them all and tells you their life stories and what they are, you know, famous for. And these names, by the way, they have cropped up in other books that I've read, and it's really made that engagement that much richer because those books don't focus on those people. But it also just makes you really sad because Roosevelt and Taft had such a decent friendship that is really destroyed near the end. And though they do sort of make up, really is sad how they use the press to destroy a friendship. So that book is really fascinating, really interesting. I have yet to read a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin that I haven't enjoyed. So, you know, she's definitely one of my favorite authors to come out of this whole thing. So hopefully you will pick up at least one of her books. But as I said, Theodore Roosevelt charging back into the arena, trying to upend his chosen successor Taft, really screws up the Republican hold on the presidency, because by splitting the vote between Taft and the Bull Moose Party, they allow for the election of Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson, the book that I read for him, is just called Wilson by A. Scott Berg. And I will admit that I went into this book expecting to be impressed by the person that is Wilson. Wilson formulated the first League of Nations. He was the president of Princeton. He was a scholar. He was an academic. And of course, he had the bad fortune to say, well, the misfortune of my presidency, this is a paraphrase, the misfortune of my presidency would be if it was chiefly engaged with foreign issues. He was a domestic issues president. And of course, poor man gets socked with World War I. Again, I expected to really enjoy this book, to really be impressed by him. I've heard good things. You know, American history as it's taught in schools is often, you know, the bare minimum on the real heavy hitters. And of course, Woodrow Wilson as the president who sees us through World War I, is one of those presidents that you can't get away without mentioning, because again, he's there for the Treaty of Versailles, the unfortunately failed League of Nations, which is the precursor to the UN. But I also found out that Wilson was the person who re-allowed segregation in Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. at that point was a city that was pretty well integrated between whites and blacks. And Woodrow Wilson said, no, we're not going to do that. And that was just really frustrating, because obviously our entire system of education does not teach civil rights appropriately, but I mean, Woodrow Wilson sent us back decades with just one choice, because when he made it okay in the nation's capital, the South said, hey, we don't have to end segregation if the president says we don't have to. So it's just really frustrating, and his ego really did seem to get in his way quite often. That was frustrating. And so, you know, I certainly didn't lose all my respect for him. He had good ideas. He had, you know, great ambitions. Obviously, the League of Nations was not a terrible idea, because we reconstituted in the United Nations and a couple of presidencies later. But you know, I really feel like this was one of those books that just took off the rose-colored glasses of the person that you get the cliff notes of in a basic history class, and really see what their bad decisions cost our country. Both in terms of race relations, but also in terms of some issues and some decisions that he made around World War I and after World War I. Woodrow Wilson quite famously tries to impose the League of Nations on a Congress that is increasingly isolationist and does not want anything to do with any more of Europe's wars, after so many Americans have died in World War I. Woodrow Wilson, of course, also famously tries to keep America out of World War I for as long as possible, until it literally, he just can't do it anymore. He runs an incredible propaganda campaign to get people ready to go into war. That part of that book alone is an incredibly revealing read on how a president can affect the popular mood. And this is far before social media or the internet or anything like that, so that was really fascinating. But he decides that he's going to go on a tour of the nation to flog his idea for the League of Nations, get people to sign the peace treaty, because America never actually signs the treaty that ends World War I. Congress refuses to ratify it, which is probably a technical issue somewhere, but it's because really they don't want to enter the League of Nations. And so Woodrow Wilson goes out on this train trip, and very soon into it he suffers a stroke, and the last year and a half of his presidency or so, he really is non-functional. There is a question about how much his wife, Edith, was running the country. There's a book called Madam President by somebody with the last name Hargrove, I believe, that I'm interested in reading. I've watched some documentaries, read some stuff, and it's really touch and go as to how much of a president, Madam President, she really was, but again, I find this interesting. There are a lot of interesting details to Wilson's life, and while the biography itself wasn't the most engaging thing, I definitely took away a lot of key points, so it was worth it in that regard. So after Woodrow Wilson leaves office, because obviously he has done 2 full terms, first of all, and second of all, he has a stroke, so he's out. America is increasingly isolationist. They want nothing to do with the rest of the world, and they elect Warren G. Harding on that bandwagon. I have not yet done a book on Warren G. Harding. As far as I can tell, he was a hard partying, hard smoking, good time boy. This comes from the biography that I read on Calvin Coolidge, and Calvin Coolidge, who is Warren G. Harding's vice president and then president after he suffers a heart attack, is like the exact opposite. So take that with a grain of salt. But yeah, Calvin Coolidge is elected vice president on Warren G. Harding's ticket, kind of because he's the opposite. Warren G. Harding is vivacious and out there, and he's a like people's person, and Calvin Coolidge is kind of like quiet and bookish and believes in budgeting. Budgeting is a very serious thing for him. He and his wife don't actually buy their own home until after they leave the White House because like the expense doesn't make sense in his budgeting. He does incredible things though for America's budget. Again, he becomes president accidentally. The book that I read for Coolidge is just called Coolidge by Amity Shlaes. I'm not sure if you're pronouncing that last name right, but that's fine. I got super into my Coolidge biography because I live in Northampton, which is where Coolidge is from. So talking about his entire life, down to the streets that it says that he walked on, the library that he went to still exists. They have his presidential papers. So it really just felt for the first time like I was living that history along with the book, and I knew exactly when they said, you know, this street or that street, like I knew what they were talking about. So it was super cool. Coolidge, I think, is also just one of those presidents that we don't spend a lot of time on. Nothing happened during his presidency, and so people just kind of skip over him. He didn't make a lot of waves. He did, again, incredible things for the American budget, slashed a lot of programs, you know, cut things down, really got the federal government back under control. But that was basically it for him. He was a quiet president who came in under adverse circumstances, but left as quietly as he came. The major thing, though, was that one of his sons did die while he was in office from an infection sustained while playing tennis on the White House lawn. And so Calvin Coolidge really had an affinity for Abraham Lincoln, who also lost a son while he was in the White House. And Calvin Coolidge really, for the rest of his life, felt that if he had not become president, his son would still be alive, and that was really weighed on him for the rest of his life. So a little bit melancholic, quiet, bookish. Again, I got into the biography because of the setting, but, you know, not that interesting of a president. On that note, that is where I am going to end this episode because I am trucking my way through some of the later biographies. I could have kept going a little bit, but I am plugging holes. It's a little bit easier as we get further and further down into more recent presidents, especially, you know, World War II forward. Obviously, FDR takes a lot of time. But yeah, I look forward to whenever I have enough quorum of books to do another one of these episodes on my main presidents. So thanks for hanging out with me today, guys. Bye!